With the recent sale of Paul Newman's Daytona fetching a staggering $17.8 million, it's easy to assume that anything bearing the words Rolex Daytona and vintage must surely be a highly coveted collector's treasure. However, it might surprise you to discover that the vintage Rolex Daytona was once considered one of the least popular ranges ever produced by Rolex. Until the late 1950s, chronograph watches were somewhat of a wandering soul in the horological landscape. Dive watches were designed for divers, pilot's watches for aviators, and so forth. But chronographs lacked a defined purpose or target audience, at least until Jack Heuer successfully persuaded his friend and racing driver, Joe Siffert, to promote his chronograph watches within the Formula One circuit. This move played a pivotal role in solidifying the chronograph's identity as a driver's essential timepiece. However, for the Daytona, there was yet another twist in its journey to prominence. In the pivotal year of 1957, history was made with the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite by the Soviet Union. This groundbreaking achievement marked a turning point, instantly reshaping our perception of the vast expanse beyond Earth's horizon. No longer an intimidating unknown, space became the next frontier eagerly awaiting exploration and conquest. Building upon this monumental success, the Soviets continued to push the boundaries of human achievement. With Yuri Gagarin's historic journey as the first human in space, they solidified their position as pioneers in the realm beyond our atmosphere. In response, NASA, the American Space Agency, heightened its own ambitions and efforts. Thus began the legendary race to the moon, an epic pursuit that captivated the world and defined the tumultuous yet exhilarating decade of the 60s. It was a time of unprecedented scientific and technological advancement as nations competed fervently to reach new heights in space exploration. Meanwhile, Rolex, recognizing a decline in sales of its 6234 chronograph, seized the opportunity in 1963 to redefine the role of the chronograph watch by setting its sights on the moon. This transformation was significant as the brand's chronograph underwent a notable evolution. It increased in size, received a bold and sleek redesign with contrasting subdials, and most importantly, saw the tachymeter scale move from the dial to the bezel, enhancing clarity and functionality. Sound familiar? That's because Omega had executed a similar strategy with its own chronograph 6 years prior. Moreover, if you doubt Rolex's intention for its 6239 chronograph to be flight qualified by NASA for all manned space missions, consider this. Several years before the watch even acquired the name Daytona, it was simply branded as the Cosmograph, a term that literally refers to the science of exploring the universe. This choice of name is particularly telling, especially coming from a company known for its straightforward and descriptive titles such as Submariner and Explorer. It's clear that Rolex had a deliberate intention behind its branding decisions. Back in the past, Rolex really wanted their watches to be chosen for space missions, but things didn't go their way. See, astronaut Wally Schirra took an Omega Speedmaster with him on his Mercury Atlas 8 mission in 1962, and it performed great. So, when Omega got the thumbs up from NASA in 1965, Rolex was out of luck. They had to think fast. That's when they decided to change their Cosmograph watch and add the word Daytona in bright red letters. It was like a quick fix to show they were still cool. But since space was no longer an option, they figured, hey, let's give racing a shot instead. So they shifted their focus to the world of racing. After World War II ended and Prohibition was over, people who used to smuggle liquor got creative. They took their fast cars, which they had tuned up to outrun the cops, and turned them into racing cars. That's how NASCAR and the Daytona 500 came to be. Rolex, a big sponsor, got involved. At the time, Tag Heuer was simply known as Heuer, but for Rolex, naming their watch the Cosmograph Daytona was kind of like admitting they made a mistake. It was like saying, oops, we're not going to space, so let's focus on racing. And if you're still not convinced that Rolex would do something like that, consider this. In 1965, Rolex started promoting their watch in connection with motor racing for the first time. Before they settled on Daytona, they even called it the Le Mans, after the famous race in France. So yeah, they were serious about this racing thing. The Daytona watch had a tough time finding its place, especially with Heuer gaining popularity in the motorsport scene. Even the special Paul Newman version of the Daytona didn't catch on much. There are stories of retailers treating them poorly, even dropping them on the floor and then picking them back up again from under the counter with their shoes. And Rolex itself wasn't a big deal back then either. Brands like Omega, Heuer, and Breitling, which had been around since the 1800s, were more popular. Rolex, founded in 1905, was kind of seen as a newcomer. It wasn't until later, when the quartz crisis hit and people started paying more attention to watches, that Rolex's achievements became clear. They were like the Tesla of the 20th century, innovative and ahead of their time. Now, let's take a closer look at the Daytona itself. The 6239 model, the last of its kind, is a bridge to the modern Daytona, like the 11600 LN. When you compare them side by side, you can see how the design has evolved. The dial is neat with black and white contrast, the hands are simple and straight, there's an external tachymeter and the pushers screw down, a feature introduced in the mid-60s as Rolex tried to figure out what the Daytona was all about. Let's dive into the inner workings of the Daytona. Rolex used what they called the Caliber 722, which was basically a modified version of the Valjoux 72, a movement that many other watchmakers used at that time. While brands like Heuer, Breitling, and Zenith were busy developing their own self-winding chronograph movements in the late 60s, Rolex stuck with this manual movement well into the next decade. This was a bit surprising since Rolex was actually the first to make an automatic watch with a rotor that could spin a full 360 degrees, so it seemed a bit cautious for them to ignore automatic chronographs for so long. It wasn't until the year 2000 that Rolex finally decided to make their own chronograph movement, the Caliber 4130. Even when Rolex switched from the old shape Daytona to the new one in 1988 with the 16520 model, they used a movement from Zenith, a version of the El Primero developed way back in 1969. It was pretty clear that at that time, Rolex wasn't fully committed to making their own chronograph movements. Rolex's journey with the Daytona has been a long one, and it's understandable why it took them so long to align it with their other models. This watch has always been a bit of an outlier in Rolex's lineup, never quite finding its place comfortably. Back in the day, its design, inspired by the Speedmaster, was bold and ahead of its time, which made it a tough sell without the kind of heritage and reputation that Omega had. While this meant it wasn't very popular when it first came out, it's now become highly sought after due to its rarity. Today, the Daytona doesn't really shine as one of Rolex's standout achievements or groundbreaking developments. Instead, it serves as a reminder that even the best brands have to start somewhere. If you enjoyed learning about this watch, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel. And if there are any other watches you'd like us to review, feel free to let us know in the comments below.